Welcome to the On List. As the title suggests, we are talking about a very interesting little blip in the commercial fragrance landscape that I want to say lasted from roughly about 1997, maybe 98, until about 2008, 2009, right before the big financial crisis that basically doomed millennials to a life of poverty, made corporations even bigger and unstoppable than they were before, since they managed to somehow consolidate all their wealth during that restructuring period, and also set most things that we know now on the path towards the aforementioned corporate homologation and homogenization, making everything basically as cheaply as possible, as broadly appealing as possible, with the highest possible margin to the point of gouging on every service, commodity, luxury, anything you could purchase, right? Min-maxed to the extreme. Before we went down that dystopian Black Mirror historical path, right before that eventual fall, which we are still, unfortunately, living through 15 years later, before that happened, we had a bit of a halcyon period. I don't want to say it was like the best of times, because it wasn't the best of times, but at least for a brief window in time, when most millennials, whether they're geriatric ones or late Gen Xers or millennials born closer to the 90s, they were in their teens and 20s during this period, and they were being courted by designers, by luxury conglomerates, by electronics suppliers. They were being courted in the same way Gen Xers were in the 80s and 90s, right? It was their time to be pandered to, right? To be catered towards. And in that window from the late 90s to the early 2000s, they were. Everyone was tripping over themselves trying to find the thing that would get millennials to spend money. And because they were trying to do that, right, instead of doing what they're doing now, which is basically just making a one-size-fits-all product for everyone, regardless of age group, back then they were still very much laser-focused on millennials, and the products they were creating during that period were pretty notorious. And when you look back on it, some of them are pretty unique compared to what we have now. But at the time they came out, they were almost universally hated, not just by the millennials who they were pandered towards, but hated by the older generations who didn't like the change in the waters of where things were going with perfume in general, and well, all things really, but we're just keeping focused on perfume, right? So they didn't like the change that was in the water, so they rejected these things. And of course, the millennials themselves rejected these things largely. So it ended up being a big flash in the pan. But while it was happening, it was kind of interesting watching it unfold. And the best way I can describe this period in perfumery, at least mainstream perfumery, niche brands, early Creed stuff, all that notwithstanding, right? This period I call the candy ozone period. I don't really know what else to call it. Frankly, there's not really a succinct description of the direction commercial perfumes took. And I don't just mean for men, I mean for women too. I mean unisex fragrances, everything. Candy ozone. Because we're talking about sharp, shrill, ozonic, aquatic notes that were acting as the projector, right? The thing that makes the perfume bloom off skin. But all the notes were very sharp, sour, punchy, sweet, very bold, vivacious, in your face. But they were not heavily syrupy or cotton candy like today's modern fragrances that are stuffed full of ethyl maltol and tonka, right? Today's stuff is basically all just like saltwater taffy. That's what it smells like now. But back then it hit a little different. Back then it wasn't bubblegum shower gel or saltwater taffy. Back then it was more like Now and Later's, Jolly Ranchers, Skittles, right? That was the vibe that a lot of the fragrances had. They had that very sharp, sour, You know, Mega Warheads is another candy, or Shock Tarts, Shockers. Spree would be another example. That really sharp, sour candy kind of vibe was what a lot of fragrances had. And that was what millennials were being served up. In some very, very strange packaging, too, right? It wasn't just that the fragrances were very odd, but the way they were marketed was also very odd. So it was a strange time to be around, right? And it's a period that, of course, the vintage enthusiasts gloss completely over. Because for them, life ended in the year 2000 anyway, let's be honest. It did. For them, once the odometer rolled from 1 over to 2, they clocked out. And they've been clocked out for the last 25 years, which is kind of unfortunate because that means you spent more of your life in reminiscence than you have actually living. But that's the job of a psychiatrist or psychologist to diagnose and to break down. I'm not certified to tackle that, right? Those aren't my demons. But regardless, once the odometer did tick over to 2000, it was a weird time. You know, and the cultural phenomenon that was happening around that time, too, is what I've heard referred to as mooks and midriffs. And that was a term created to describe the content appearing mostly on channels like MTV. Those of you who remember how MTV used to be in the 2000s, it was all Jackass and Tom Green and Andy Dick and Total Request Live and all of these girls who looked like Bratz dolls, where they had the high-cut shirts and the belly button hanging out with the little piercing, which is where the midriff term comes from. Meanwhile, the guys all had backwards hats and were acting real stupid and real like this. So the guys were the mooks, right? The guys were like this. So the guys were the mooks and the girls were the midriffs, because stupid, jacked up full of testosterone and caffeine, tripping and falling over themselves, girls up there shaking their size 0 waist, trying to look like a living Barbie doll. It was a fantasy land, right? That was how MTV and all of the Jersey Shore and the Real World and all that stuff, and all the other reality shows too that were happening around that time, like Big Brother, you know, The Surreal Life was another one. That was what we had. That was what was going on. And all of that stuff filtered into the fragrances too, right? Especially because smartphones were just becoming a thing. We were still in the phase where we had full keyboards, right? And the screens all did weird swooshy things, like the Blackberries slid up, the kick tops, or what they called them, sidekicks, flipped open like this, like a Lamborghini scissor door flipped open. So the guys had the gadgets, they had the iPods, they had the smartphones, the Blackberries, the Palm Pilots. Everyone was fascinated with earbuds, and everything was trying to be smaller, and laptops were smaller. And that was back when we had what was called netbooks, the little tiny laptops that were really just for web browsing. Before tablets, right? This is before tablets, but that's what we had. And it was all about being in the future and being goofy as hell, overly sexed up, overly dumbed down, right? Listening to Britney Spears, or listening to something like O-Town, right? Something like O-Town. So that was the vibe. And that vibe filtered into the fragrances. And that leads me to the candy ozone descriptor. Now, a lot of these fragrances lived and died in the moment, okay? Just like the culture did, obviously. Andy Dick, Tom Green, what happened to both of them, right? They kind of burned out. A lot of the celebrities that were ground through the meat grinder by MTV and other similar stations at that time, they're all washed up now too. Not very many of them survived. I mean, Carson Daly's kind of hanging on by a thread. I don't know what the hell he's doing now. He's doing something. But whatever it is, people don't really care, do they? Right? So we also had a lot of Jackass comedies around that time. We had all the Mike Myers stuff, all the early Will Ferrell stuff, all those goofy movies. That was the vibe. Dude, Where's My Car with Ashton Kutcher in it. Really goofy-ass movie, too. That was the vibe, and those were the perfumes we wore. Now, I know some of you are going to say, hey, what about the Tom Ford stuff? What about the YSL stuff? What about the Gucci stuff? What about Reeve Ghosh? and new Parfum and all that sort of thing. And I'm like, yes, that retro stuff also existed. But bear in mind, unilaterally, all of that retro stuff failed. All of it failed. It was all discontinued. And nowadays, they're all unicorns, and the same vintage guys who wouldn't touch that stuff back then when it was new, now they worship it, because now it's a sought after collectible, so now they love it. But in the heat of the moment, when you could get Rive Gauche on shelves, nobody wanted it. Oh, I don't want that. I want the original Azzaro. I want the original Caron Porno, or the original Z14. I don't want this modernized rehash crap. Then the moment it gets discontinued, oh, this was a masterpiece. This is an unsung hidden gem, best thing ever came out of the 2000s. Oh, I've got 15 bottles now, and all that bullshit. But that was outlier stuff, guys. Let's not get it twisted. That was outlier stuff. The Tom Ford stuff for Gucci Group was all outlier stuff, with the exception of maybe M7. M7 didn't do that well, but it did the best out of all that stuff, right? M7 was the best thing he put out, commercially speaking. That even it too was considered a failure. It's why he kind of got his walking papers and went and formed his own label, right? Formed his own house, where he could do what he wanted, carte blanche. But the vibe for most people was that candy ozone. Now, what is a candy ozone fragrance, right? It's like I'm making up shit here, guys. I'm making stuff up. What is it? What is a candy ozone fragrance? Well, since I'm more or less inventing this term myself, I get to be the one that gives you the definition of the term. So when I call something a candy ozone fragrance, I am referring to a fragrance that feels like it is mostly, and I say mostly with an asterisk, because I don't know all the materials, okay? I don't know all the components, but for me, a candy ozone fragrance is a fragrance that is mostly based out of the aquatic genre. So therefore, you can infer that it has things like galaxolide, ambroxan, dihydramycin. It's going to have a lot of white musk profiles, a lot of hedione things are going to be in it, a lot of various bright, shiny, smooth, warm, fresh things. So, of course, ethylene, brassylate, helvetolide, all that stuff is going to be jam-packed into these kind of fragrances, all right? You're going to have lots of white floral material, so hydroxycitronellol is going to be up in there, okay? Kalone or watermelon ketone is going to be up in there. That's what it is. Various lactones will be in there too to infer peach notes and stuff like that. So all the really fruity, fruit basket, fresh, you know, Mama Jama type stuff that you guys, all the Jamba Juice stuff, right? All the Jamba Juice notes are going to be in there. And I know a lot of you guys who only like oak moss and civet and pine oil and birch tar and nothing else. That's all you like. So your whole life is one giant cigar shop forevermore. You just, everything is Murphy's oil soap and burnt cigars. That's all you enjoy. That stuff to you is like kryptonite, okay? If I hold up some Kalone to you, to your forehead, it'll burn an upside down cross on your forehead. It'll be like taking a vampire and splashing holy water on it. That's what happens to you when I hit you with the Kalone. You're like this. But that's the palette. Unfortunately, that's the palette that the painters of the day, the olfactive painters, that's the palette they were using to create their happy little Bob Ross trees. They were making them out of galaxolide. They were making them out of peach lactones. They were making them out of Kalone and all other sorts of things like that. You know, very high-powered versions of hedione, including hedione high cis and all that sort of thing. It's just, it is what it is, okay, guys? I didn't say it was the best thing in the world. I didn't say it was some misunderstood genre that needs more appreciation. I'm not saying at all that these perfumes need more love. I'm just saying that they were a thing. I am just trying to validate them as saying, yep, that was a thing, that happened. That's all I'm giving you here, is that this is a thing. Whether you like the thing or don't like the thing, that's up to you. I don't really care. So, the big houses, honestly, they came around to this stuff a little earlier than you might think. Usually the big houses are less willing to change, right? The big houses, the Chanels, the Diors, those guys, they let the weird outliers do weird stuff first, and if it catches on, then they jump on it, right? Chanel also likes to do their own Chanel thing, and they like to make fragrances that really stand out from everyone else by having that Chanel polished smoothness, almost boring level of polish, right? Over finessed, basically, overproduced fragrances. Chanel is like the olfactive equivalent of auto-tune. Chanel smells like you're using Ableton on your perfume, okay? That's what it smells like. If you could somehow make Ableton work on your fragrances, you'd have Chanel. But they were actually one of the first to jump on this. And they did it with stuff like Allure in the late 90s, and of course Allure Homme, also in the late 90s. Then they came at it with the Coco Mademoiselle, very sharp, fruity, floral, punchy, sour fragrance that is, with transparent musks in the base. I like Coco Mademoiselle. I'd wear it myself, but I admit it is basically candy ozone, right? Dior would do it too with Higher. Those of you who remember Higher, that has that peach note, that like pear sort of thing in the opening. And then you would see some of the lesser acts roll out in their wake, right? The lesser acts, the Calvin Kleins, the Kenneth Coles, those guys, the Perry Ellis brands, they would roll out their version too. Although, funnily enough, one of the most infamous of all these candy ozone perfumes was actually Calvin Klein. Because, you know, Calvin Klein loves to do experimental, avant-garde, futuristic stuff anyway. Or at least they used to. They don't now. Nowadays, they just issue the same crap everyone else is issuing. Defy was terrible. But you know, back in the 2000s, they were still trying to hit it futuristic. Like they were still living in that cyberpunk Blade Runner world with their perfumes back in the 2000s. So they issued a little fragrance called Crave, 2002. And this thing came in like a photon torpedo plastic pod. And you opened it up, and then you took the bottle out, and the bottle was also plastic, and it was see-through, and it had a little orange button that was made of rubber, like a membrane, a rubber membrane. You pushed it, and the juice squirted out the side. And that was some of the harshest, most sour of all of that stuff. It's like you were just literally squirting gushers. Remember the little chewy gushers things? You were squirting gushers right on your skin. You smelled like a pack of gushers. If you wore CK Crave in the day, back in the day, if you wore that, you smelled like a pack of gushers. I don't care. You can hate me all you want for saying that. That fragrance didn't last very long, and it got discontinued. And some of y'all go absolutely nuts for that. You pay big prices for that. You pay $200+ for that. And I don't understand why you'd want to spend $200 to smell like a pack of gushers. Yeah, the package is cool or whatever, but Kenneth Cole did it better, actually. And Kenneth Cole did the same thing with the plastic bottle. They had like a little hockey puck shaped bottle. It was, I actually call it the hockey puck. It's a plastic round bottle, all plastic, with a plastic membrane inside, a plastic shell around it, some kind of fake diamond plate looking stuff. And then it had a built-in sprayer. And it had the same basic vibe that Crave had, except much smoother. Like a much smoother, more refined, more wearable Crave. So if you like Crave, but you wish the Crave didn't smell like someone splashed you with battery acid, right? You want to take the battery acid element out of your Crave, then the Kenneth Cole fragrance called New York, and there's New York for women and New York for men. Men is the one that I have. I haven't smelled the woman's one in years, but it was also pretty in that same train of thought, right? But the plastic hockey puck bottle, and I wore that so much, I actually still have bottles of that. Also discontinued, unfortunately. But then, you know, Carolina Herrera jumped on that train with Chic and Chic for men. Kenneth Cole would keep popping out these candy ozone fragrances. That was their thing. Kenneth Cole kind of became the brand for the candy ozone, because they rolled up with Black in 2003, which was a bit mintier and drier, and I liked it better. Harry Fremont composed that with Sabine de Charner, Sabine de Charner and Harry Fremont made that fragrance. Kenneth Cole Black is probably the best of all those, honestly. If you will only allow yourself one of these candy ozone fragrances from the 2000s. You can only let yourself have one. Let it be Kenneth Cole Black. Let it be that one. That is probably the crowning achievement. And then, of course, Abercrombie & Fitch Fierce. It's the only one from that style that's still actually popular. All of those have, if they haven't been discontinued, if they're still sold, they're just not popular. They're discounted. You find them in Ross. You find them in TJ Maxx. But for some reason, Fierce is the one that really punched through and carried on. People still wear it now in 2024. And it is like the ultimate candy ozone fragrance. Like you smell, they used to pump it through the air vents, right? They pumped the Fierce through the air vents of the store. So you could smell Abercrombie & Fitch from like 100 feet away. You could smell it before you saw it. And then once you got there, you're like, oh, God. Like that, it's so strong. But, you know, I remember the guys would just wear tons of it with the little abs on the bottle, making it look all sexy and stuff. That's what it was. And then Kenneth Cole had Reaction in 2004. And that was also like a cucumber melon sort of take on the whole candy ozone thing, a little cooler. Again, a little more sedate. And then Signature in 2005, the last reel of that style before they began to phase out of the candy ozone into more other fragrances. The Signature was kind of the last of the line. So that one's more grapefruity and a little more like woody. So a little more serious, but still pretty candy ozone, right? Candy ozone, but mature, like a candy ozone in a suit and tie. Suit and tie candy ozone. Candy ozone going to a nice restaurant. That's what that was. And, you know, the train kept it rolling. Calvin Klein popped out a couple more candy ozone fragrances. They had Calvin Klein Woman. They had Ralph Lauren had the romance fragrances, right? The romance fragrances were pretty much in that same train of thought, too. And then, you know, you had, Polo Black. Polo Black was literally a watermelon mango fragrance with a timber silk base. Think about that. Watermelon and mango with timber silk. That was Polo Black. It is the least polo smelling polo fragrance on earth. And it's the one everyone hates. Everyone dumps on it. But me, I love it because obviously, you know, watermelon mango is like a really rare thing in a man's fragrance, right? So I love it. It's just so goofy and high strung and high energy and bright. And it just puts a smile on my face. That fragrance makes me smile. And then Boss had their orange creamsicle thing with Boss in Motion, the little glow bottle. All of these really high-strung candy ozone fragrances, if you notice, they all had really goofy bottles. Globes, plastic pods, hockey pucks, whatever. Calvin Klein had Euphoria in 2006. That was also, again, towards the end of that style. We wouldn't see too many more candy ozone fragrances, really. By the time the market crashed in 2009, everything went austere. We went from bulls to bears, right? Once everybody lost their ass. So the fun times were over by 2009. But Perry Ellis had Portfolio, which was like a pear fragrance. And then I think one of the last ones also from that period was the Nautica Voyage. And a lot of you guys still like Nautica Voyage. It's crazy. You guys still like, that's another one that survived the candy ozone period because that fragrance is like sour apple Jolly Ranchers. Take sour apple Jolly Ranchers and drop it into an aquatic perfume. Aquatic, sour apple, Jolly Ranchers. But y'all in 2024, you still love it. Don't know why, but you still love it. It's crazy to see. Crazy to see, right? So, okay, that's about going to wrap it up for me. I would have named more women's perfumes. I mean, Victoria's Secret had some, all right? They had Very Sexy. That was a candy ozone fragrance, too. There was also a male version of that as well. More of the candy ozone stuff. A lot of these boutiques, okay? Hollister, OP, Express, Victoria's Secret. A lot of them were really into the candy ozone. So Victoria's Secret was another big guilty culprit of the candy ozone. So, but it was a thing, and for a brief window of time, it was very popular, like I said, until the bottom fell out, and now we live in dystopia. So this has been the video on candy ozone. Catch you next time. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Goodbye.